In the autumn of 2019, a man named Thomas Harrington sat alone in the reading room of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. He was 63 years old, a retired professor of geography from the University of Virginia, and he had spent the better part of 4 decades studying the evolution of cartography. Maps were his life. They had been his obsession since childhood, when his grandfather first showed him an old atlas from 1890 and explained that the world had not always looked the way it appeared on modern globes. Thomas had seen thousands of maps in his career. He had handled originals from the 16th century, traced his fingers along the coastlines drawn by Portuguese explorers, studied the meticulous calculations of French cartographers. He thought he knew everything there was to know about the history of map-making. He thought he understood how geography had been recorded, preserved, and passed down through generations. He was wrong. On that autumn afternoon, Thomas had requested access to a collection of maps that were not listed in the public catalogue. They had been mentioned in a footnote of a dissertation he had read 30 years earlier, a footnote that described a private donation made to the library in 1923 by a collector named William Ashford. The collection was supposed to contain maps from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, maps that showed the North American continent before the westward expansion had been completed. What Thomas found in that collection would change everything he believed about history. The first map he examined was dated 1802. It showed the eastern coast of what is now the United States, but the names were different. Cities that should not have existed for another 50 years were already marked. Infrastructure that historians claimed was built in the 1850s appeared fully developed, and in the center of the continent, where the Great Plains should have been empty and unexplored, there were symbols he had never seen before: geometric patterns, networks of roads, a system of organization that suggested not wilderness but civilization. Thomas turned the pages slowly. His hands trembled. Each map revealed more impossibilities. A document from 1798 showed the Mississippi River lined with what appeared to be industrial facilities. A chart from 1815 depicted the Rocky Mountains not as an unexplored barrier, but as a region already mapped in extraordinary detail, with settlements and pathways that no expedition had ever recorded. A survey from 1823 contained measurements and coordinates that matched no known historical project. The retired professor sat in that reading room for 7 hours. He did not eat, he did not drink. He simply stared at the maps, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he had been taught. When the library closed that evening, Thomas walked out into the cold Washington air and stood on the steps of the building. The Capitol dome glowed in the distance. The city hummed with the sound of modern life, and Thomas Harrington, a man who had dedicated his entire career to understanding the world through maps, realized that he understood nothing at all. The world had not always looked like what they taught us. Someone had changed the story. Someone had erased what came before. The history of cartography in the United States is supposed to follow a clear and logical progression. In the early colonial period, maps were crude approximations based on limited exploration and indigenous knowledge. As the nation expanded westward, surveys became more accurate, more detailed, more comprehensive. By the mid-19th century, the great cartographic projects of the federal government had mapped the entire continent with scientific precision. This is the story we are told. This is the history preserved in textbooks and encyclopedias. This is the official record. But scattered across archives throughout the country, in private collections and forgotten libraries, there exist maps that tell a different story. Maps that were made before the supposed explorations, yet show details that should have been impossible to know. Maps that depict cities that officially did not exist, roads that were never built, and territories that were never conquered. These are the forbidden maps of Tartaria, The name itself is a mystery. On maps from the 17th and 18th centuries, vast regions of the world were labelled as Tartary, Tartaria, or Grande Tartarie. European cartographers used these terms to describe territories stretching from Eastern Europe across the entire Asian continent, and in some cases extending into North America itself. The official explanation is simple. Tartary was a vague geographical designation for lands inhabited by Tatar peoples, a catch-all term for regions that European explorers had not yet mapped in detail. But this explanation fails to account for the specificity of what these maps show. They do not depict empty wilderness or unexplored territory. They show cities, they show roads, they show infrastructure, they show the marks of civilization. And when we compare these old maps to the official historical record, the contradictions are staggering. Thomas Harrington was not the first researcher to notice these discrepancies. As early as the 1970s, independent historians had begun documenting anomalies in antique maps. They photographed documents in European archives that showed North American cities decades before their supposed founding. They collected evidence of cartographic projects that had been mysteriously discontinued, their records destroyed or sealed. They traced the provenance of maps that had been quietly removed from public collections and transferred to restricted sections. But their findings were dismissed, labeled as conspiracy theories, relegated to the margins of academic discourse. The maps, however, remained. Silent witnesses to a history that someone, at some point, decided we were not supposed to remember. In the Smithsonian Institution, there exists a collection of 19th-century surveys that have never been fully catalogued. In the National Archives, there are sealed boxes from the General Land Office containing maps and documents that researchers cannot access without special permission. In private collections across the country, from Boston to San Francisco, there are family heirlooms passed down through generations, maps that grandfathers showed to grandchildren with whispered warnings, "Never show this to anyone outside the family." The question is not whether these maps exist, the question is what they show, and why, for more than a century, there has been a systematic effort to keep them hidden. Thomas Harrington spent the next 3 years of his life trying to answer that question. He traveled to archives in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and New Orleans. He interviewed collectors, antique dealers, and fellow academics. He compiled a database of more than 400 maps that contained unexplained anomalies, maps that did not fit the official timeline of American history. What he discovered was not a simple error or a series of coincidences. It was a pattern, a deliberate pattern of erasure that stretched back to the early 19th century and continued into the present day. Someone had rewritten the maps. Someone had changed the geography. Someone had erased what the world once looked like. And Thomas Harrington, sitting alone in his study, surrounded by photocopies and photographs, began to understand why. The evening was cold in Washington when Thomas made his discovery. But the chill he felt had nothing to do with the weather. It came from inside, from the realization that the ground beneath his feet, the very land he had walked on his entire life, had a history that he had never been told. Maps are not just drawings of geography, they are records of power. They tell us who controlled what territory, who built what infrastructure, who claimed what resources. A map is a statement of dominion, and when maps are changed, when they are erased or redrawn or hidden, it is because someone's dominion has changed. The forbidden maps of Tartaria suggest that before the history we know, before the colonial period and the founding of the nation and the westward expansion, something else existed on this continent, something that was not supposed to be remembered. The question that haunted Thomas Harrington, the question that would consume the final years of his life, was simple but devastating. What happened to Tartaria? What happened to the civilization that these maps once recorded, and why were we never told? Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because what comes next will change how you see every map, every city, every building you have ever known. Subscribe now so you do not miss what history tried to hide. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, the birthplace of American independence, a place where history is supposed to be preserved, honored, celebrated. But beneath the monuments and the museums, in the basements of old buildings and the back rooms of antiquarian shops, there exists another Philadelphia, a city of secrets, a city of documents that were never meant to be found. In the spring of 2020, Thomas Harrington traveled to Philadelphia to meet a man named Marcus Webb. Marcus was 71 years old, a retired archivist who had spent his career working for the Pennsylvania Historical Society. He had contacted Thomas after reading about his research in an obscure academic journal. Marcus claimed to have information that could not be discussed over the phone or email. Information that had to be shared in person, in a place where no one could overhear. They met in a coffee shop in the old city, surrounded by tourists photographing the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall. Marcus was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous habit of looking over his shoulder. He spoke in a low voice, barely above a whisper. For 40 years, Marcus explained, he had been cataloguing documents in the Society's restricted archives. Most of the materials were routine, land deeds, court records, business correspondence. But occasionally he would encounter documents that did not fit any known historical category. Documents that were immediately flagged for special handling and transferred to a section of the archives that even senior staff could not access. In 1987, Marcus had found a collection of maps that had been donated to the Society in 1911 by the estate of a Philadelphia merchant named Jonathan Whitmore. Whitmore had been a collector of cartographic curiosities, and his collection included over 200 maps dating from the late 18th century to the 1850s. According to the donation records, these maps showed territorial configurations prior to current national boundaries. Marcus had examined the maps before they were transferred. What he saw had haunted him for more than 3 decades. The maps showed a North American continent that did not match any version of history he had ever learned. Cities with names he did not recognize. Transportation networks that crisscrossed the continent in geometric patterns, regions labeled with terms like Northern Tartaria, Western Grand Province, and Central Unified Territory. And everywhere, symbols that suggested not wilderness or colonial outposts, but advanced infrastructure. Marcus remembered one map in particular. It was dated 1789, the year of George Washington's inauguration as the first president of the United States. But the map did not show a newly independent nation struggling to establish itself. It showed a continent already organized, already developed, already mapped with a precision that should have been impossible for that era. The most disturbing detail was the city where Philadelphia now stands. On the 1789 map, there was already a major urban center in that location, but it was not called Philadelphia. It was called something else, a name that Marcus could not remember, a name that seemed to slip from his memory every time he tried to recall it. When Marcus reported his findings to his supervisors, he was told to forget what he had seen. The Whitmore collection was classified as historically sensitive and transferred to permanent restricted status. Marcus was warned that discussing the materials with anyone outside the society would result in immediate termination and potential legal action. For 33 years, Marcus kept his silence. But now, at 71, with his career behind him and his health declining, he no longer cared about the consequences. He wanted someone to know. He wanted the truth to survive. Thomas listened to Marcus's story with growing unease. The details matched patterns he had observed in other archives, maps that did not fit the official timeline, collections that were suddenly classified, researchers who were warned to forget what they had seen. He asked Marcus if there was any way to access the Whitmore collection. Marcus shook his head. The materials had been moved to an off-site storage facility in the 1990s. No one knew exactly where. The records had been sealed, but Marcus had one piece of evidence. Before the collection was transferred, he had made a single photograph. One image captured quickly and secretly before the maps were taken away. He had kept that photograph hidden for 3 decades, waiting for someone who would understand its significance. Marcus slid an envelope across the table. Thomas opened it with trembling hands. The photograph was faded and slightly blurred, but the details were clear enough. It showed a portion of a map dated 1802. The map depicted the region that is now the American Midwest, from the Great Lakes to the Missouri River. And across that region there was a grid. A perfect geometric grid of roads, settlements, and what appeared to be a coordinated system of land division. The grid was not approximate or symbolic. It was precise, mathematical. It looked like the work of surveyors with advanced instruments and comprehensive planning. But in 1802, according to official history, the Midwest was unexplored territory. The Lewis and Clark expedition would not begin for another 2 years. The region was supposed to be wilderness, inhabited only by indigenous peoples and a few scattered French traders. The map told a different story. The map showed that someone had already been there. Someone had already surveyed the land, divided it, organized it. Someone had already built what would later be erased and rebuilt under different names. Thomas stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked up at Marcus and asked the question that had been forming in his mind since his first discovery in the Library of Congress. Who erased the old world, and why? Marcus had no answer, but he had one more piece of information. A name. A man who, according to old records Marcus had found, had been involved in the reorganization of territorial documentation in the early 19th century. The name was Albert Gallatin, Secretary of the Treasury under Thomas Jefferson. The man who oversaw the financial infrastructure of the young American nation, and according to Marcus's research, the man who may have supervised the largest cartographic erasure in history. The story of Albert Gallatin is well known to historians. Born in Geneva in 1761, he emigrated to the United States in 1780 and became one of the most influential figures in early American government. He served as Secretary of the Treasury from 1801 to 1814, longer than any other person in history. He helped finance the Louisiana Purchase. He advocated for internal improvements, roads and canals. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant administrator and a dedicated public servant. But there is another side to Gallatin's legacy, a side that does not appear in the history books. In the early 1800s, at the same time that Gallatin was managing the nation's finances, a massive project was underway to standardize the maps of the United States. Before this standardization, there were hundreds of different maps circulating, created by different surveyors, explorers, and cartographers. Some of these maps agreed with each other. Many did not. The goal of the standardization project was ostensibly simple: to create a single, authoritative map of the nation that would serve as the basis for all future surveys and land claims. This project was coordinated through the Treasury Department, which had jurisdiction over the General Land Office. But something strange happened during this standardization. Maps began to disappear. Collections that had been held by private individuals and institutions were purchased, donated, or seized, and then never seen again. Cartographers who had created maps that contradicted the new standards were discredited or silenced, and the old maps, the ones that showed a different version of American geography, were systematically removed from circulation. By the 1820s, The project was complete. A new cartographic reality had been established. The old maps had been erased. Marcus Webb had found fragmentary records of this project in the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives, correspondence between Treasury officials and state governments, inventories of maps that had been collected for review and correction, reports on the disposal of documents that did not meet new standards. The language was bureaucratic and vague, but the implications were clear. There had been a coordinated effort to control what maps existed and what they showed, and that effort had been remarkably successful. Today, when historians study early American cartography, they rely on a relatively small number of maps that survived the standardization. These maps all tell roughly the same story. A nation expanding westward into unexplored territory, building roads and cities where none had existed before. But the forbidden maps, the ones that were hidden or destroyed, tell a different story. They suggest that the expansion was not into empty wilderness, but into the ruins of something that came before. Thomas Harrington left Philadelphia with more questions than answers. He had confirmed that the pattern of erasure was real, that it had been coordinated, that it had been deliberate, but he still did not understand why. What was on those old maps that was so dangerous it had to be destroyed? What civilization had existed before the one we know? And how had it been erased, not just from the maps, but from memory itself? The answers, he suspected, lay not in the archives of the East Coast, but in the heart of the continent, in the places where the old world had left its most visible traces, in the cities and buildings that should not exist, in the infrastructure that was too old, too grand, too impossible to have been built when the official record claimed. Thomas Harrington packed his bags and headed west, toward Chicago, toward the architecture that could not be explained, toward the ruins of Tartaria. The journey from Philadelphia to Chicago is approximately 750 miles. By modern standards, it is a routine trip, completed in less than 2 hours by air or a single day by car. But in the early 19th century, according to official history, this journey would have taken weeks. The roads did not exist. The infrastructure was not yet built. The territory was still being surveyed and settled, and yet, on the forbidden maps, the path from Philadelphia to Chicago was already marked, not as a rough trail or a projected route, but as an established thoroughfare, a road that connected two major urban centers, passing through intermediate settlements that were spaced with mathematical regularity. Thomas thought about this as he flew over the landscape. Below him, he could see the grid pattern of Midwestern farms, the straight lines of roads and highways, the geometric organization that defined the region. This pattern was supposed to be the result of the Land Ordinance of 1785, which established a system for surveying and dividing Western territories into rectangular sections. But what if the grid had already existed? What if the Land Ordinance did not create a new system, but simply renamed and reclaimed an old one? The questions multiplied as the plane descended toward Chicago. And Thomas knew that the city below him, with its inexplicable architecture and its impossible history, would provide some of the answers. Chicago, the city that rose from nothing, the city that was built twice, once before the Great Fire of 1871 and once after. The city whose official history is a monument to American ingenuity and determination. But the buildings that survived the fire and the photographs that documented what stood before it suggest something far stranger than the official narrative. Thomas Harrington was about to enter the heart of the mystery, and what he would find there would shatter everything he thought he knew about the past. Chicago burns, October 8th, 1871. The Great Fire, a catastrophe that destroyed more than 3 square miles of the city center, killed hundreds of people, and left a third of the population homeless. This is the story we are told. A fire started in a barn, spread through wooden buildings, and consumed the heart of a young city that was barely 40 years old. The fire was a tragedy, but also an opportunity. Chicago rebuilt itself bigger, stronger, more modern. The disaster became a symbol of American resilience. But the photographs taken before the fire tell a different story, and Thomas Harrington, sitting in the Chicago History Museum surrounded by images from the 1860s, could not reconcile what he saw with what he had been taught. The buildings in those photographs were not the simple structures of a frontier town. They were massive stone edifices with classical columns, ornate facades, and architectural details that would have required decades of skilled craftsmanship to create. Government buildings, commercial palaces, hotels that rivaled the grandest structures of European capitals, all supposedly constructed in the span of 30 years, in a city that had been incorporated in 1837. Thomas studied a photograph of the Cook County Courthouse taken in 1869. The building was enormous, occupying an entire city block. Its design featured elaborate stonework, a central dome, and architectural proportions that suggested not hasty frontier construction, but centuries of refined tradition. According to official records, this building had been completed in 1853, just 16 years after Chicago was incorporated as a city. 16 years to design, plan, quarry stone, transport materials, and construct a building of that magnitude. In a city that, according to official history, had been a swampy trading post just 2 decades earlier. Thomas had studied architecture as part of his cartographic research. He knew how long it took to build stone structures of that scale. He knew the logistics involved, the skilled labor required, the infrastructure necessary to support such construction, and he knew that the official timeline was impossible. The photographs showed what Chicago looked like before the fire: massive buildings, grand avenues, a city that appeared to have been standing for generations. And then the fire came, and then the rebuilding, and then a new history was written, one that explained away the impossible architecture as the product of American ambition and hard work. But the old photographs remained, silent witnesses to what had really existed. Thomas found similar patterns in every major American city he researched. In Boston, there were photographs from the 1850s showing buildings that appeared centuries old, buildings that were later demolished or burned and replaced with structures that matched the official historical narrative. In New York, there were images of grand public buildings that supposedly were constructed in just a few years, feats of engineering that would challenge modern construction companies. In San Francisco, there were records of a city that seemed fully developed in photographs from the 1860s, decades before the population growth that could have supported such construction. Everywhere he looked, the pattern repeated. Old photographs showing impossible buildings, official histories claiming rapid construction and a systematic destruction, whether through fire, earthquake, or planned demolition, that erased the physical evidence. The forbidden maps and the impossible cities were connected. The maps showed a continent that was already developed, already organized, already civilized before the official timeline. And the cities preserved traces of that earlier civilization, traces that had been systematically eliminated over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Thomas Harrington sat in the museum, surrounded by photographs of buildings that should not have existed, and felt the weight of a truth that he could barely comprehend. The world we know was built on the ruins of another world. A world that had been erased from the maps, demolished from the landscape, and forgotten from memory. In the reading room of the Newberry Library, one of the great research institutions of Chicago, Thomas found more evidence of the erasure. The library held one of the largest collections of historical maps in the United States, and Thomas spent weeks examining documents from the 18th and 19th centuries. Most of the maps in the public collection followed the familiar pattern. They showed the gradual exploration and settlement of the continent, the expansion of the United States from a collection of coastal colonies to a nation spanning from sea to sea. They matched the official historical narrative. But in the restricted section of the library, accessible only to credentialed researchers with special permission, there were other maps. Maps that had been donated by private collectors in the early 20th century. Maps that had been quietly removed from the main collection and placed in permanent storage. Thomas managed to gain access to some of these materials through his academic credentials. What he found confirmed everything he had suspected. A map dated 1795 showed the Great Lakes region with a level of detail that should have been impossible. Every coastline was precisely rendered. Every tributary was accurately positioned. And along the shores of Lake Michigan, where Chicago now stands, there was already a city. Not a trading post or a frontier settlement, but a city with streets, buildings, and infrastructure. The city had a name. Thomas copied it carefully from the map, letter by letter. The name was not Chicago. The name was something older, something that had been replaced and forgotten. He found similar maps showing other regions. The Ohio River Valley with established settlements decades before the official founding of cities like Cincinnati and Louisville. The Mississippi Corridor with urban centers that predated the Louisiana Purchase. The Pacific Northwest with developed ports that appeared long before Lewis and Clark ever reached the coast. Each map was a fragment of a lost world, and each fragment pointed to the same conclusion. The official history of American settlement was a fabrication. Something else had existed before, something that had been deliberately erased. Thomas spent 3 months in Chicago, following every lead, examining every document he could access. He interviewed local historians, antique dealers, and architecture enthusiasts. He photographed buildings that still bore traces of the old construction beneath their modern facades. He compiled a record of everything he found, knowing that this evidence was fragile and might itself be erased. And then, one evening in June, he received a phone call that would change the direction of his research. The caller identified himself as James, no last name. He claimed to be a former employee of a government agency that he would not specify. He said he had been following Thomas's research and had information that could help him understand the larger pattern. James proposed a meeting, a location in downstate Illinois, far from the city. Thomas was wary, but his need for answers overcame his caution. He agreed to the meeting. There are moments in every investigation when the search for truth becomes something more than intellectual curiosity. Moments when the researcher realizes that the mystery they are pursuing is not just historical, but personal. That the erasure they are documenting was not just an event in the past, but a wound that still bleeds into the present. Thomas Harrington, driving through the flat farmland of Illinois toward a meeting with a stranger, felt that moment approaching. The forbidden maps had shown him a world that had been hidden. The impossible cities had shown him the ruins of what remained. And now he was about to learn why. Why the old world had been erased. Why the new history had been written. And why, after more than 2 centuries, there were still people working to keep the truth hidden. If you have felt something stirring inside you as you listen to this story, if you have sensed that the world you know is not the world that was, leave a comment now saying, "I remember what they tried to make us forget." Let the world know that the memory survives. The meeting place was an old farmhouse, abandoned and decaying, surrounded by fields of corn that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Thomas arrived at dusk, when the light was fading and the shadows were long. There were no other cars on the road, no signs of habitation, just the farmhouse, the fields, and the enormous silence of the Midwestern plain. James was already there, waiting on the porch. He was in his 60s, with grey hair and the careful posture of someone who had spent a career in positions of authority. He did not shake Thomas's hand or offer any greeting. He simply gestured for Thomas to follow him inside. The interior of the farmhouse was sparse but clean. Someone had prepared it for this meeting. There was a table with 2 chairs, a lamp, and a folder thick with documents. James sat down and indicated that Thomas should do the same. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The lamp cast a circle of light in the darkening room. Outside, the corn rustled in the evening breeze. And then James began to talk. He had worked, he explained, for an agency whose name he would not reveal. His job had been to manage archives, specifically archives related to land surveys and property records. He had spent 35 years cataloguing, organizing, and in some cases, disposing of documents that the government deemed no longer necessary. In 1998, he had been assigned to a special project. The project involved the review and assessment of historical materials that had been stored in a secure facility since the 1920s. The materials had been sealed for 80 years, and now, for reasons that were never explained to James, they were to be reviewed, catalogued, and in most cases destroyed. The materials were maps, thousands of maps. Maps from the 18th and 19th centuries, maps that had been collected from across the country and stored in this single location. And the maps showed a version of American geography that James had never seen before. He had been given strict instructions. The maps were to be photographed, catalogued with minimal description, and then incinerated. No copies were to be made. No records were to be kept beyond the basic inventory. The project was to be completed within 6 months, and when it was done, the facility would be decommissioned and the building demolished. James had followed his instructions. He had catalogued and destroyed thousands of maps over the course of those 6 months. Maps that showed cities where none were supposed to exist, roads that predated any known survey, a continental infrastructure that contradicted everything in the historical record. But he had not destroyed everything. He had kept copies. Not many, and not the most significant documents, but enough to prove that the project had existed, enough to show that the erasure was still happening, not just in the past, but in the present day. James slid the folder across the table. Thomas opened it and began to examine the contents. The copies were photographs, some clear and some degraded. They showed portions of maps from the late 1700s and early 1800s. And on these maps, Thomas could see what James had described, a North American continent that was already organized, already developed, already civilized. One image showed a map dated 1784. The map depicted the eastern seaboard from Maine to Georgia, but the names were different. The cities had different designations. And inland, where the Appalachian Mountains should have marked the boundary of colonial settlement, the map showed roads and settlements extending deep into the continental interior. Another image showed a map from 1801. This one focused on the Mississippi Valley, and it depicted the river not as a wild frontier, but as a major commercial artery lined with ports, warehouses, and what appeared to be factories. The level of detail was extraordinary. This was not a speculative drawing or an imaginative projection. This was a survey map created by someone who had seen what they were recording. Thomas looked up at James. He had so many questions that he did not know where to begin. But James anticipated him. The maps, James explained, were part of a collection that had been assembled in the early 20th century by a consortium of government agencies and private institutions. The purpose of the collection was to gather and control all cartographic evidence of what had existed before the current historical narrative was established. The collection was never meant to be public. It was never meant to be studied. It was meant to be hidden and eventually destroyed. James did not know who had originally ordered the collection to be assembled. He did not know the full extent of what had been gathered, but he knew that the project was ongoing. That even now, in the 21st century, there were people working to find and eliminate any surviving evidence of the old maps. Thomas asked the obvious question. Why? Why would anyone go to such lengths to hide what the world once looked like? James was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Because, he said, the old maps prove that the official history is a lie. They prove that the civilization we think we built was actually rebuilt on the ruins of something older, something that was destroyed, something that was erased. And the people who did the erasing, James continued, are still in power. Their descendants, their institutions, their systems. If the truth came out, if people understood what had really happened, everything would change. The legitimacy of governments, the ownership of land, the very foundation of modern society would be called into question. The erasure was not just about maps, it was about control. Control of the past, and through the past, control of the present and future. Thomas sat in the farmhouse, holding photographs of maps that should not exist, and felt the enormity of what he was learning. This was not a historical curiosity or an academic puzzle. This was a cover-up that had lasted for more than 2 centuries, a systematic effort to hide the truth about what had existed before. And he, Thomas Harrington, a retired professor from Virginia, had stumbled into the middle of it. James gave Thomas the folder and the photographs it contained. He said that his own time was limited, that he had already taken too many risks by making contact. But he wanted someone to know. He wanted the evidence to survive. Before they parted, James told Thomas one more thing, a location, a place where, according to documents he had seen during the 1998 project, some of the original maps might still exist, not copies, but originals, documents that had escaped the destruction because they had been removed from the main collection before the incineration began. The location was in New Mexico, an old Spanish mission, abandoned for over a century, where a cache of maps and documents had supposedly been hidden in the 1850s. James did not know if the cache still existed. He did not know if it had already been found and destroyed, but it was a lead, the only lead he could offer. Thomas thanked James and walked out into the night. The cornfields stretched dark and silent around him. The stars were bright above, unobscured by city lights. And Thomas felt for the first time in his life that he was part of something larger than himself. The forbidden maps of Tartaria were not just artifacts of a lost history. They were weapons in a war that had been fought for 200 years. A war for the truth. A war for memory itself. And Thomas Harrington, whether he wanted to or not, had become a soldier in that war. He drove through the night, heading south and west, toward New Mexico, toward the old Spanish mission, toward whatever fragments of the truth might still survive. The drive from Illinois to New Mexico is approximately 200 miles. Thomas made the journey in 2 days, stopping only for fuel and brief rest. He thought about what James had told him. He thought about the maps he had seen, the buildings he had photographed, the pattern of erasure he had documented. And he thought about what it would mean if the truth came out. If people learned that the world they lived in was not the world they had been told about. If they understood that their history, their geography, their very sense of place had been manipulated and controlled. The implications were staggering. Land ownership, national boundaries, legal systems, all were based on the assumption that the official history was accurate. If that history was a fabrication, then everything built upon it was also built on a lie. Thomas understood why the erasure had been so thorough, so relentless, so ongoing. The people in power had too much to lose. The truth was not just inconvenient, it was existentially threatening. But Thomas also understood something else. The truth could not be completely destroyed. It could be hidden, suppressed, marginalized, but somewhere in some archive or collection or abandoned building, there would always be fragments that survived. And those fragments were enough to reconstruct what had been lost. The forbidden maps proved that another world had existed, and as long as those maps survived, even in copies and photographs and fragmentary records, that world could be remembered. Thomas crossed the Texas Panhandle as the sun rose on his second day of driving. The landscape was flat and endless, a sea of brown grass under a pale blue sky. He thought about the old maps showing this region, maps that depicted not empty plains but organized territories, roads, settlements. If those maps were accurate, then beneath the modern surface of America, there was another America, an America that had been buried and forgotten. And Thomas was driving toward the place where a piece of that buried America might still exist. The mission was located in the high desert of northern New Mexico, in a landscape of red rock and juniper, mesa, and canyon. Thomas found it using coordinates that James had provided, coordinates that did not correspond to any known historical site. The building was ruined but recognizable. Adobe walls, crumbling but still standing. A bell tower, empty and silent. A courtyard filled with debris and desert plants. This had once been a place of worship, a center of community, a point of civilization in an unforgiving landscape. According to the official record, the mission had been built by Spanish Franciscans in the late 1700s and abandoned after the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. It was one of dozens of similar missions scattered across the Southwest, remnants of the Spanish colonial period that had been left to decay when the region changed hands. But James had said that the mission held something more. A cache of documents hidden in the 1850s when a group of people fleeing the cartographic erasure had sought a place where their evidence might survive. Thomas explored the ruins carefully. The main chapel was empty, its roof collapsed, its walls exposed to the elements. The living quarters were similarly ruined, rooms filled with sand and the bones of animals. But beneath the courtyard, according to James's information, there was a cellar, a storage space cut into the rock where the documents had been hidden. Thomas searched for hours before he found the entrance. It was concealed beneath a flat stone in the corner of the courtyard, invisible unless you knew to look for it. The stone was heavy, but Thomas managed to shift it enough to reveal a narrow passage leading down into darkness. He descended with a flashlight, his heart pounding. The passage was short, perhaps 20 feet, and it opened into a small chamber carved from the bedrock. The chamber was dry and cool, protected from the desert heat by the earth above. And in the chamber, Thomas found what he had come for. There were boxes, wooden crates sealed with wax and leather straps. The crates were old, clearly from the 19th century, but they had been stored in conditions that preserved them remarkably well. Thomas opened the first crate with trembling hands. Inside were maps, dozens of maps, rolled and stored in protective tubes, and documents, papers written in English and Spanish and French, letters and reports and inventories. Thomas spent the next week in that underground chamber, cataloguing what he had found. He set up a small camp in the ruins above, sleeping in his car, and descending each morning to continue his work. The maps confirmed everything he had suspected. They showed North America as it had existed before the erasure, cities with names he did not recognize, roads that connected those cities in geometric patterns, a continental civilization that stretched from coast to coast. But there was more. The documents included correspondence from the 1850s, letters written by people who were fleeing the standardization. They described what was happening, maps being confiscated, archives being sealed, people who spoke of the old world being silenced. They described a coordinated effort to rewrite history, to replace the names and the places and the memory of what had existed, and they described what that old world had been called. Not Tartaria exactly. That was the European name, the name used by cartographers who had never visited the continent. The people who lived here had used different names, names that varied by region and language. But there was one name that appeared repeatedly in the documents, one designation that seemed to encompass the entire civilization that had existed before. The name was written in several languages, but the meaning was the same. The Great Territory, the unified lands, the old world that had covered the continent before the erasure, before the renaming, before the destruction. Thomas sat in the underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of a civilization that had been systematically hidden, and felt a profound sadness. These maps showed cities that had been home to millions of people. These documents described a society with roads, commerce, government, culture, and all of it had been erased, replaced with a story of wilderness and conquest. The people who had hidden these materials in the 1850s had known what was happening. They had tried to preserve the truth, and for more than 170 years their cache had remained hidden, waiting for someone to find it. Thomas photographed everything. He made digital copies of every map and every document. He knew that the physical materials were vulnerable, that they might be discovered and destroyed, just as so many other archives had been. But the copies would survive. The evidence would endure. And then, on the seventh day, Thomas heard a sound from above. Vehicles approaching the mission, engines and voices, and the crunch of tires on gravel. Someone else had found the hidden chamber, and Thomas knew with terrible certainty that they had not come to help him. Thomas moved quickly. He gathered his cameras and his copies, stuffing everything into a backpack. He climbed the passage to the courtyard and peered through a gap in the crumbling wall. There were 3 vehicles, black SUVs with tinted windows, 6 men in dark clothing, moving with military precision. They were searching the ruins, methodically checking each building. Thomas did not wait to learn who they were. He slipped through a break in the back wall of the courtyard and made his way into the desert. The terrain was rough, covered with rocks and brush, and he moved as quickly as he could without making noise. Behind him, he heard shouts. They had found the entrance to the underground chamber. They knew someone had been there. Thomas ran. He ran through the desert as the sun set and the shadows lengthened. He ran until he reached a canyon and followed it down toward a valley where he hoped he could find a road, a town, some way to escape. The men pursued him for hours. He could hear them behind, their footsteps on the rocks, their voices calling to each other. But the desert was vast, and the night was dark, and Thomas knew the terrain in a way that his pursuers did not. By dawn, he had reached a small town on the edge of the desert. He found his car, which he had parked miles from the mission as a precaution. He drove, not stopping, not looking back. He drove until he crossed the state line, until he reached a city, until he felt safe enough to stop and think about what had happened. The cache had been discovered. The men in black had found it just as they had found and destroyed so many other archives over the centuries. The physical evidence was probably already being destroyed, but Thomas had the copies. He had photographs of the maps, digital files of the documents. The evidence survived even if the originals did not. And he had something else. He had a story to tell. A story about forbidden maps and impossible cities, about a civilization that had been erased and a history that had been rewritten. Thomas Harrington knew that his life would never be the same. The people who had pursued him would not stop looking. They had been keeping this secret for 200 years, and they would not allow one retired professor to expose it. But the truth was more powerful than any organization. The truth had survived for centuries, hidden in archives and basements and underground chambers. And now, for the first time, someone was ready to bring it into the light. 6 months have passed since Thomas Harrington fled the New Mexico desert. He has moved 3 times, changing locations whenever he feels the watchers getting too close. He has learned to communicate through encrypted channels, to store his files in secure servers scattered across the world, to trust no one completely. The evidence he gathered has been shared with a network of researchers who, like him, have stumbled onto fragments of the forbidden maps. They work in secret, comparing notes, building a picture of what the old world looked like. They are archivists of erasure, documenting what was hidden so that it can never be forgotten again. Thomas has not published his findings through any official academic channel. He knows that such publication would be suppressed, discredited, destroyed. Instead, he has chosen a different path. He has shared his story directly through channels that cannot be controlled. And that story is what you have just heard. The forbidden maps of Tartaria are real. They exist in archives and collections across the United States, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be found by anyone who knows where to look. They show a world that was erased, a civilization that was destroyed, a history that was rewritten. The official record tells us that the American continent was wilderness before European colonization, that cities were built from nothing in a matter of decades, that the infrastructure we see around us is the product of modern engineering and American determination. But the old maps tell a different story. They show cities that existed before the founding of the nation, roads that crossed the continent before any expedition, a civilization that was organized, developed, advanced. What happened to that civilization? The documents Thomas found in the New Mexico cache suggest an answer, though the details remain unclear. There was a reset. A catastrophe of some kind. Though whether natural or deliberate is not certain, the old civilization was destroyed or abandoned, and in its place a new order emerged, one that claimed the infrastructure of the old world as its own and rewrote history to hide what had come before. The standardization of maps in the early 19th century was part of this rewriting. The fires that destroyed so many American cities were part of it too, though whether they were accidents or something else remains unknown. And the ongoing suppression of evidence, the classification of archives, the pursuit of researchers like Thomas Harrington, all of this is part of the same effort to keep the truth hidden. But the truth cannot be completely erased. It survives in fragments, in photographs, in the testimony of witnesses. And now, it survives in the story you have just heard. Thomas Harrington does not know what will happen to him. He knows that the people who have kept this secret for centuries will not give up easily. He knows that his life is in danger. But he also knows that the truth is more important than any individual, that the memory of what was lost deserves to be recovered. The last photographs Thomas took in the New Mexico chamber showed a map dated 1756. The map depicted the entire North American continent, from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And on that map, the continent was not divided into colonial territories or indigenous lands. It was a single entity, a unified civilization that stretched across the landmass in a network of cities, roads, and organized regions. The name of this civilization, written across the center of the map in elegant script, was different from any modern designation. It was the name that the people who lived there had given to their world. Thomas has not shared that name publicly. He believes that some things should remain hidden, at least for now. The name is not what matters. What matters is that we remember, that we understand that the world we live in is not the only world that has existed, that beneath the surface of our cities and our roads and our maps, there are traces of another history, another people, another civilization. The forbidden maps of Tartaria are the key to that memory, and as long as they survive, the truth cannot be completely erased. Thomas Harrington continues his research wherever he is, whoever is watching. He has dedicated the remainder of his life to this work. He knows that he may never see the full truth revealed, but he also knows that every fragment he preserves, every story he shares, brings that truth a little closer to the surface. And someday, Perhaps sooner than we think, the old world will be remembered, the erasure will be undone, and we will finally understand what the world looked like when it was nothing like what we were taught. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you watched this far, it is because something in these words resonated with you, because you, like Thomas Harrington, sense that the world is not what it appears to be. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the moment to join. The stories we share here are pieces of a larger truth, fragments of a memory that has been suppressed for too long. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. If you found meaning in this story, leave a comment saying, "I watched this far." This simple phrase lets me know that you are part of this community, that you care about the truth, that you are ready to remember what history tried to make us forget. Press the like button if this story moved you. Share it with someone who is ready to question what they have been taught. The forbidden maps are real. The old world existed, and together we can ensure that it is never forgotten again. Until next time, keep looking. Keep questioning, keep remembering,